مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. هل رئيس أوباما بتا أرجاء أم طائر حر؟ نعم، في نوفمبر كاس حزبه واحدة من أسوأ الهزائم في الانتخابات التشريعية على مر التاريخ، ولكن بدلا من قضاء وقت طويل في توضيح أسباب هذه الهزيمة، كرس الرئيس نفسه لتغييرات كبرى في السياسة، خاصة في السياسة الخارجية، ويشمل ذلك تمديد فترة بقاء القوات الأميركية في أفغانستان، والتوصل إلى اتفاق حول البيئة مع الصين، والأهم من كل ذلك إنهاء 50 عاما من العزلة لكوبا. هل نشاط الرئيس يوحي بأنه يتجه صوب تغييرات أكبر في العام المقبل؟ لمناقشة ماضي السياسة الخارجية للرئيس أوباما ومستقبلها، يسرني أن أرحب باثنين من كبار الخبراء المؤثرين في واشنطن، وهما بيتر بروكس ودينيس روس. Welcome back to Dakhil, Washington. I'm sitting here with Peter Brooks and Dennis Ross to talk about the year that was and the year that will be in American foreign policy. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Nice to be with you.
So it was just almost a year ago that the Washington Post wrote about the president's State of the Union address about foreign policy and listed a handful of issues that he thought would be high on our agenda in 2014, pushing for a nuclear deal with Iran, pulling out of Afghanistan, preventing terrorists from hitting the homeland, Syria, nuclear disarmament, and very little, though, on Arab Spring or the pivot to Asia. Now, when we look back on these 6 issues, what happened? Which ones actually made the president's agenda this past year, and which ones didn't? Peter, why don't I start with you?
Well, I mean, we know which ones didn't make it. I mean, obviously, Russia went into Crimea in the spring. The Ukraine situation, critically important. He talked about Iran. That happened this year. Yes. Syria, I don't think he could certainly avoid that. Not much talk about China, the rise of China, and especially its military buildup. And what else was there?
Well, ISIS obviously emerged
Right.
in a very big way, and now you could say that's certainly related to Syria. I would say, I think your point on both Russia and China is important, because China becoming much more assertive in its own backyard, we see in the East and South China Seas. That, I think, obviously doesn't get reflected quite the way, obviously, it might be reflected today. Although the Asia pivot was designed, obviously, to deal with what we saw as being not only the increased importance of Asia, but at least subtly a kind of way of contending with the rise of China. So I think maybe he does better in retrospect on some of these than one might anticipate, because when you talk about terror and security of the homeland, well, that relates to ISIS, even if, in fact, he didn't at that point foresee the rise of ISIS and the fall of Mosul and the takeover largely of Anbar province. So, I mean, I think certain things he obviously didn't foresee, and other things somehow relate to where we are.
And of course, nuclear disarmament. It's not, I don't recall exactly what he was referring to there, but if he was talking about a nuclear deal with Iran, it must have meant others. He had actually hoped to go back to Russia to undertake something like a new start or renewed start, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, and maybe North Korea, which there's not much going on other than the cyber stuff right now. In fact, I believe the administration's policy has been called strategic patience. It's probably have less patience now, considering what happened with the movie The Interview, but that may have been on that list of nuclear disarmament, Russia as well as North Korea.
All right, so let's take a look at some of these issues individually. When one looks back a year ago, the president spent as much time on Iran in his State of the Union as every other issue combined. It was clearly the top of the agenda. We didn't get an agreement. How high do you think it'll be in 2015? Do you think the president still believes an agreement is possible? And is he going to devote how much of his administration to trying to get it? Dennis?
Yes. Short answer is yes. I think that remains a very high priority for him. I think that he will continue to make a major effort in that regard. It's clear that the Secretary of State is determined to do all he can to try to produce it. I think the real question mark is, are the Iranians willing to do it? The truth is the United States and the 5+1 moved very far to try to accommodate the Iranian red lines. It's very hard to see where the Iranians moved. They didn't, if they moved, their moves were much more limited. And so the question becomes, are the Iranians, is the Supreme Leader prepared to live with a deal or not? It's possible that they didn't reach the agreement because they hoped that we would continue to move towards them, and the administration would say, when we say no deal is better than a bad deal, we prove we meant that because we didn't reach an agreement. I think the real question will be, does the decline in the price of oil, which constitutes the equivalent of a significant new sanction on Iran, does that have an effect on the Iranians and make them more likely to reach an agreement or not? Or is it that the Supreme Leader's basic view of the need to preserve revolutionary ideology is such that his readiness to do a comprehensive deal is limited, and he's prepared to live with what they have right now, which is to create what I would describe as a new normal, where their program is capped, but they're also in a position where they're in many ways a nuclear threshold state.
So the implication of your comment is that the variable is in Tehran, that it's up to the Iranians.
Exactly.
Do you think that the administration accepts this logic, or do you think they're going to try to put more on the table to entice the Iranians to reach the deal?
Americans love a deal. They love to close the deal. And the question is, and I think the concern is that we don't want a deal that's a bad deal. But one of the other things that Dennis brought up is the price of oil. I think that would have been something too. That's having a huge foreign policy effect when you think about it. Countries like Iran that depend on high oil, Russia, which needs a $100 barrel of oil to meet its financial requirements, the rest of the Middle East, Venezuela here in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, these are all critical issues, and I don't know if the president had thought much about that when he gave his State of the Union, but he may talk about it this year.
So connected to the price of oil and Iran is this new commitment that the president made over the course of 2014 to degrade and ultimately defeat the Islamic State, a term which didn't even exist in our lexicon a year ago. How do you think this is going to color American foreign policy in the balance of the president's term? Peter?
Well, I think there's a concern about American credibility. Is the president going to do what he says he's going to do? I think there are also some concerns about the timeline, the level of effort going towards ultimately defeating the Islamic State. I think it's critically important, but once again, we don't know what next year is going to bring for us.
And Dennis, do you think in the administration's mind there's a connection between the commitment to ultimately defeat ISIS and the pursuit of a deal with Iran?
Even though the administration continually denies that there's that kind of a connection, I suspect that there actually is. I think there's a hesitancy to suggest in any way that we're coordinating with Iran, even as they bomb in Iraq, they have special forces in Iraq, they have drones in Iraq, we bomb in Iraq, we have special forces in Iraq, and we have drones in Iraq. There's clearly deconfliction going on, and I suspect, and clearly these were the public stories related to the president's letter to the Supreme Leader about a month before the deadline on trying to negotiate the deal, the nuclear deal. The whole point of that letter was apparently to suggest, look, we have common interests and we can pursue those more easily and more extensively if there's a nuclear deal. So I think there is that kind of a connection. I would be careful about it because I think every time we have suggested it, I think the Iranians look at it and say, oh, that means they're desperate, they need us. And the truth of it, last time I checked, ISIS is a whole lot closer to them than they are to us. I believe this will remain an important priority for the administration. I think what the Iranians can contribute here, they're going to do because it's in their own interest, and clearly in a place like Syria, we are coming at it from what should be very different starting points. And I think the real challenge in our strategy on ISIS is less in Iraq and much more in Syria. We have a contradiction there. We obviously have to do something against the ISIS positions in Syria so they don't have a safe haven, but if we're doing that in a way that frees Assad's hand to go after the non-ISIS Syrian opposition, it becomes self-defeating not only in Syria, but it becomes self-defeating in terms of the Sunni partners we need to actually discredit ISIS. And so I think reconciling that contradiction will be a major issue in this year. And I think it also gets at the point Peter was raising about credibility.
And so when you look back, when you look forward toward 2015, Peter, what do you think is a legitimate benchmark at the end of 2015 the president can say, you know, we achieved real progress in the overall challenge against ISIS? What would be a success at the end of 2015?
I think getting the Iraqi government back up on its feet, the Iraqi military up on its feet, being able to deal with the situation in Iraq, and that would include issues regarding the Kurds, but also then having some sort of plan for Syria. I mean, we have a government in Damascus we're not fond of. We don't have a real opposition to deal with ISIS, and I think also important thing would be containing the Islamic State to that part of the world and not seeing terrorist attacks in places like Europe or the United States or elsewhere, and also Al-Qaeda shifting from places like Afghanistan, such as the Khorasan group, there, containing them. I mean, I ultimately want to see them crushed, but I think since we were caught, I think, on our back feet a bit, I think we need to contain that and then start turning over to the offensive and dealing with the Islamic State and other Al-Qaeda elements that are common in that area.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about some issues from Crimea to Cuba, which weren't originally on the president's agenda last year, and we'll see if they'll be on it next year in just a moment. Again, my panelists include Peter Brooks. Peter is a senior fellow for national security affairs at the Heritage Foundation, Washington's preeminent conservative think tank. In addition, Peter is serving his fourth term as a congressionally appointed member of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. He previously served in the administration of President George W. Bush as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Affairs. In this post, he was responsible for U.S. defense policy for 38 countries and 5 bilateral defense alliances throughout Asia. A prolific writer and media commentator, he is the author of the book A Devil's Triangle: Terrorism, Weapons of Mass Destruction, and Rogue States. It's a lovely trio, Peter. His colleague here is my colleague, Dennis Ross, the counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which he rejoined after 3 years' service in the Obama administration, first in the State Department and then as senior director for the Central Region on the National Security Council. So, gentlemen, let me ask you about Russia first, a country which didn't figure a year ago, but which blew up by invading Ukraine, and then now the oil price shock has hurt Russia even more than our sanctions. In 2015, what are the Russians going to do? Are they going to recede and be tamed, or are they going to lash out and put themselves even higher on our agenda? Dennis?
I think they're going to remain high on the agenda. I don't think that we're going to see Putin immediately change his posture. Putin has an image of Russia's role in the world, and I think he believes basically that it's very important for Russia to, in a sense, fulfill a kind of destiny as it relates to not only a certain place in terms of world politics, but also reestablishing kind of sphere of influence. And this is someone who takes a sphere of influence I think very importantly. And I suspect just generally he's not going to want to look like he's conceding in the face of pressure. The question becomes, does the decline in the price of oil create such pressure on him he has to look for a way out? And my own sense is in the near term, he's not going to move. I think he feels, if you listen to what he had to say in his annual 3-hour fest with the press, he said this is temporary. There'll be a correction, and we can last with this. We can manage this. And I would say that he will test to see if he can manage this. So I don't anticipate any swift moves at trying to reach out to the West or somehow reach some kind of new accommodation. I don't anticipate a sudden change in his posture towards the Ukraine. I think you'll see him do what he's done. He'll sound from time to time more conciliatory. You'll see the ceasefire talks renew. You'll have periods where suddenly there's a degree of calm, and then the same basic factors that have been at play on the ground with Russian support will continue. He's not going to accept a certain outcome in Ukraine where he doesn't have control over what the Ukrainian government ultimately is going to be prepared to do.
Peter, do you agree?
I think that's a good assessment. I think Dennis has given a good assessment there. We could see an increase in nationalism. We're seeing some of that already. He could strike out against somebody in the region or do something very provocative to make people forget about the economic privations they're going through. Dennis didn't really mention the sanctions, but they are having some effect as well, besides the price of oil, which I think is half of what Russia needs to meet its finances. But I think Russia is going to try to make things more difficult for us in other parts of the world. They're reaching out to China. They said we don't have to sell our oil and gas to Europe; we'll sell it to China. So they're looking for outs here. Of course, they're not getting a good price on that oil or gas, by the way. They're also interested in Latin America. Even though there's been some potential huge changes in American views towards, or American policy towards Cuba, they are interested in Cuba. We see all these flights around NATO, reconnaissance flights. We see them reaching out into places into the Far East. They have a relationship with Iran. So I think they're still going to make it difficult for us. I mean, I always think when I try to understand what Putin is thinking, back in 2005, he said that the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, that didn't make my list.
Okay, Russia's still on the agenda then.
Yes, absolutely.
Another country.
Crimea's not going back, by the way.
Crimea's not going.
It's not going back to Ukraine. Now the question is does he take eastern Ukraine? But I think he'll keep things bubbling along there just to make the West unsettled.
Cuba, an issue nobody talked about until everybody talks about it. Ending 50 years of isolation, secret diplomacy. The president did two major secret negotiations, starting about 20 months ago. One with Cuba, one with Iran. Iran led to negotiations, not a deal. Cuba led to a deal. Is this the president's way of doing business?
Well, I do think he is feeling politically freer. I mean, they didn't do this deal before the midterm elections. This deal emerged after the midterm elections, and I think that's a sign that he says, all right, I've got 2 years left. There's no more elections that are going to affect me or the Democratic Party, at least from my standpoint. And I think the move on immigration, the move on Cuba, are both manifestations of him feeling, all right, look, there are things I can do using my executive powers, and I'm going to do that. And I think he sees also the virtue of having those who he trusts engage in what will be discreet diplomacy. So I think we could see more of this. I think it is a kind of mode of operation that he's feeling very comfortable with. He doesn't have to worry about leaks. He doesn't have to worry about things undercutting him as a result. He depends upon people who he relies on. And so I think, yes, if you ask, are we going to see more potential use of this kind of diplomacy, my guess would be yes.
All right, so we only have about a minute left. Where else would he do a secret deal? Peter?
I was going to say where's North Korea?
Yeah.
Iran, Cuba, North Korea, but I don't think that's going to happen in this, considering what we've seen over the last couple of weeks with the cyber war.
Any guesses on where another secret deal might be?
Well, it still could be related to Iran, that basically, you use a private channel to try to cut the final deal. And if there's going to be one, I suspect it's going to be something like that produces the final breakthrough.
And wild cards. We had so many wild cards in 2014, Crimea, for example. What would be a wild card that's a reasonable wild card we can identify as a possibility now?
I would say I'm concerned about the East and South China Seas and China. As you know, China claims the entirety of the South China Sea, which is about 1 million square miles. They have territorial disputes with the Philippines, with Japan. And I worry about, since Chinese becoming much more capable militarily, more planes in the air, more ships at sea, that there might be an incident that could lead to a crisis, either between the Japanese and the Chinese, or even between the United States and China itself. So China is something we have to pay attention to. It hasn't got as many headlines this year, an underreported story, but I think very important strategically.
Okay. Dennis, a wild card?
I basically agree with that because I also think you have a very nationalistic leader of Japan now, and even though they calmed things down recently, in a sense you have two places that are using nationalism increasingly as a source of increased legitimacy. And nationalism becomes a double-edged sword, and sometimes it creates a dynamic of its own. So, if no one is paying attention, and China, by the way, even though I think they're very much affected by their internal dynamic, which is, I think, driving them more as much as anything at this point, the fact of the matter is the decline in the price of oil is quite good for them. It's going to make them feel, I think, somewhat more comfortable, and it could make them more assertive.
So, with everything else going on, keep our eyes on China, Japan, and East Asia.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much, and wishing you a good 2015.
You too.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول قرار إدارة أوباما بفتح العلاقات مع كوبا، أرجو أن تتصلوا بي مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.